All right, how's it going, guys? So this is lesson 6.2. Why do we have seasons? So why do we have seasons? Well, there's a couple of key reasons why we have seasons. The three main reasons is that the Earth's always orbiting around the sun. So the Earth will go around the sun, it will orbit the sun one time in a year, or 365 days. The second key thing about Earth is that Earth is always at a tilt. If you ever look at a globe, like this globe right here, you will notice the globe, if you look at the equator, right, the center line in the globe, it isn't like this, right? You ever notice that the globe isn't straight up and down? It's actually at a tilt. If you were to set it on a table, it's going to be at a tilt. Well, if you measured that angle, it's a 23.5-degree angle. And that is the angle of the Earth at its tilt in relationship to the sun. So no matter how the Earth spins or where the Earth is at in its orbit around the sun, it is always at this 23.5-degree angle. That is its axial tilt. The other key thing to know is that the Earth is continually rotating. It's always rotating, okay? So the Earth is always spinning, and it spins around one time in a day for 24 hours, okay? It spins around one time in a day. And a lot of times we don't really notice the fact that, well, we're moving over 1,000 miles an hour. We're moving really fast, but in relationship to our size on this giant planet, it doesn't seem like much. You would never know you're moving 1,000 miles an hour unless we were investigating it, which we are. So you can see here the sun is in the middle and the Earth is moving around. Now, its position in its orbit around the sun, where it's at in that given year time, decides its season. It may be winter, it could be spring, it could be fall, or it could be summer. It just depends on where it's at in that orbit. So let's go here to the next slide. So those patterns, though, okay, which we've just looked at, they always remain the same, as does its seasonal pattern. You ever notice that we always have fall after summer? We always have spring after winter, right? Well, there's a reason for that. These things are cyclical, meaning they happen in cycles. So we will always get summer, then fall, then winter, and then spring, and then summer again. Will always be that way. And that's because of the Earth's position as it orbits the sun. So again, the Earth rotates on that axis once every single day. It will always orbit the sun 365 days or in a year. And depending upon where that orbit is, where it is in that orbit, the Earth is going to experience different seasons. And that also depends where you're at in relationship to the Earth. But regardless of wherever you are, the seasons always go in order. So we talked about this tilt, right? And how the equator is right in the middle. You guys have ever heard that, here in California, we live relatively close to the equator. Generally, if you live close to the equator, you live in, warmer climates. That's why most of the life is towards the middle of the equator, because it's a more hospitable environment. And the reason that is because whether you're in the northern or southern hemisphere, if you're closer to the equator, in all 4 seasons, you receive the most sunlight. Okay, this is what we call solar irradiance, and that's the intensity of the radiation that the sun actually applies on the surface of the Earth. It's measured in the amount of heat or energy given in a specific surface area. The less direct that the sun hits the Earth, the less heat we gain from it. The more direct, the more heat we gain from it. And depending upon where you're at, whether you're in the northern hemisphere above the equator, or if you're in the southern hemisphere below the equator, that changes depending upon where the Earth is at in its orbit around the sun. What's always constant is that the northern and southern hemispheres will always have opposite seasons. So if it's spring in the southern hemisphere, it's fall in the northern hemisphere. If it's summer in the northern hemisphere, it's, yes, you guessed it, winter in the southern hemisphere. Let me show you what I'm talking about. These two hemispheres, this one being the northern, this one being the southern, are opposite in their position to the equator. The equator is right here. The sun is applying more direct light at this given time on the northern hemisphere. It's not applying as much direct light on the southern hemisphere. So it would be winter in the southern hemisphere at this time and summer in the northern hemisphere. So, and this changes. If the Earth was over here, it would be spring in the northern hemisphere and fall in the southern hemisphere. Hopefully you're picking up on these patterns. I'll show you this little simulation. I think it's pretty helpful. You can see the degree of solar radiance that specific parts of the Earth are actually picking up. So the sun is applying more direct sunlight to what? The southern or the northern hemisphere? Should be southern hemisphere, right? You could see this is the equator. So this is the lower half of the Earth. So this southern hemisphere, from which it rotates once a day, right, is experiencing more sunlight, more direct sunlight, and therefore experiencing more heat than the northern hemisphere. However, this is at this given time. So in this given time frame, the southern hemisphere is in the summer and the northern hemisphere is in the winter. And this should look familiar because if you look over here, it's January. Now I live in California, as do most of my students, all of my students, hopefully they're not going to be. So it is winter in January. In the southern hemisphere, this is summer, right? So if we were to speed this up and we were to go to, well, when it's summer in the northern hemisphere, right, in June, July, you can see, okay, which area is getting more sunlight, direct sunlight? Be the northern hemisphere. This is why here in Visalia it's 110 degrees in the summer, right? Because we are experiencing more direct sunlight than the southern hemisphere, who would at this time be in the winter. Okay, and this is also true for if it's, we'll say, March, right? In March, the northern hemisphere is in spring, and the southern hemisphere is in fall or autumn. Well, same thing. And then if we went over to maybe September, you would notice that the southern hemisphere is in spring, the northern hemisphere is in fall or autumn. So it all depends on how direct that sunlight is, and that will determine which season we are in and whether the Earth is around the sun and in this quarter or that quarter or this quarter or that quarter. That changes things for us. We experience different weather, and remember that the southern and northern hemisphere are always at opposites. So if it's summer here, it's winter there. So think about that the next time you plan your cross the equator vacations. All right, guys. Next time we'll be looking at the moon and lunar eclipses, and then we'll move into solar eclipses, and just be some interesting stuff. We can really notice how the behavior of the sun and the behavior of the Earth around the sun and the moon affect what we're experiencing here on the planet, what we know about our planet. All right, guys. Till next time.